actually had the upper hand, or for that matter, was collecting a win. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a recent win, and it may not seem like a particularly sexy one. It wasn't like, yes, freedom was achieved in one fell swoop. No, but as far as budgetary transparency and accountability, a hard battle was fought and won. This one came out in favor of the taxpayers. I've got the details.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Know Where to Hide. My name is Brian Hyde, and I'm happy to sit down with you a couple times a week and just go through a few examples of mainstream media bias. Oftentimes it's aspects of stories that have been omitted and are just enough to keep you from arriving at an informed conclusion as to what's going on. And this is especially important when the Idaho legislature is in session, particularly when it comes to the taxpayers' money. In fact, this tweet came in, or at least I noticed this tweet just recently. Apparently today, all the Democrats and a few members of the Main Street Caucus in the Idaho legislature, this would include folks like Raymond and Lanting and Blanksma, who was just removed from her majority position, voted against H-460. That's the public schools appropriation bill, which is $263 million more than the previous year. Now, this is because of some budgeting things that have been changed, some budgeting procedures which separate necessities from things we'd like to have, line item things. And apparently the post here, this is Idaho Freedom Caucus, says, look, they're throwing a tantrum over the budget reform process and using school kids as pawns. So let's go into some details about this budget battle. For this, we want to thank Ron Nate, who is the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, for coming together with this very concise breakdown of what's been taking place in the last few weeks and days. So budget reforms win, and the Main Street Caucus gets a little bit of a beatdown. Ron tells us this was a very big week in the Idaho Capitol for the average Idahoan struggling with inflation, taxes, and overbearing government. Key votes in the Idaho House and Senate will lead to leaner budgets, less waste and fraud and abuse, and neutering the so-called Main Street Caucus, which colluded with Democrats and fought these good outcomes all along the way. So let's break down what that looked like and what exactly was taking place. First of all, we go to budget reform. Why was there a need in the first place? Well, Ron tells us in the last 4 years, government spending in Idaho has increased by 54%. That's in the last 4 years. And the new budget process of considering base budgets separate from growth budgets potentially eliminates the waste, fraud, and abuse we've seen recently. In fact, if you haven't seen the IFF documentary, Rogue Bureaucracy, it's kind of a startling peek into the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, as well as what other agencies and bureaucracies can get away with. Now, this budget reform procedure promises lower spending and with that, lower taxes. The budget reform means legislators won't have to vote on all the big increases wanted by agencies just to keep the agencies running. In other words, the legislature can vote to keep the lights on without voting to grow the government. It's kind of nice to have that option. Several rogue legislators tried to upend the budget reform process, but key votes in the House, 38-31, and Senate, 28-7, approved the base budgets without the big increases included. So that means the growth budgets have to be considered separately and with fewer line items and dollars included. So moving on, next Ron tells us a little bit about, let's get to the next slide here. The crazy week in the Capitol. So here's what happened over the last part of last week and the early part of this week. Last week on Friday, Idaho Freedom Foundation reported about the attempted coup in the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee, or JFAC, and the deception used by rogue legislators to trick Idahoans into thinking the budget reform plan is a bad idea when it's truly good. We correctly pointed out how Senate leaders were supportive of the rogue legislators' maneuvers. Now, this week was full of fireworks in the Senate State Affairs Committee. On Monday morning, we saw Senate leaders, including Winder, Anthon, and Lee, all adamantly support Senator Cook's bill to control your cell phones and other devices to supposedly filter pornography from kids. Now, that's a bad bill with a misplaced emphasis on manufacturers. But for context, Cook was one of the rogue senators in JFAC who defied the chair's budget reform plans. And instead of being punished or reprimanded, Senate leaders were over the top defenders of Cook and his cell phone bill just one legislative day after the hijacking of JFAC. Kind of interesting how that worked out. Now, because of the hijacking of JFAC, there were two sets of bills on their way through the House and Senate. One set was the budget reform plan of all new base budgets separate from the line items planned for later, while the other set was the 14 agency budgets passed on Hijack Friday with all spending for each agency included in one bill each. So which set would win? And therefore which budget procedure would win? Well, the House leaders and most House members stuck by their JFAC co-chair, Representative Wendy Horman. It took a few days to hash it out, but on Wednesday, the House voted to pass the base budget bills separately from the growth budgets on a 38-31 vote for the first bill. Now, that signaled the votes on the other base bills to come and the budget reform procedure preferred by the House. Now the Senate was stuck. Do they agree to the budget reform package, or do they bugger up the process by voting on the hijack procedure? Well, on Thursday, the Senate gave in and finally voted 28-7 to ratify the budget reform process. Now, it didn't go unnoticed in the House that the 9 Republican JFAC members defied committee procedure and the co-chairs of JFAC to vote for big spending budgets instead of budget reform. They were hijacking the budget committee. And by all appearances, the rogue senators had the blessings of Senate leadership. So would the rogue House members on JFAC similarly have the blessings of House leadership? Well, the House's answer was a flat no. The Idaho House beat down the attempted hijacking of the budget committee. The so-called Main Street Caucus, or MSC, of leftist Republicans in the House and Senate, who comprised many of the JFAC rogue members and other key members in the House, were working hard to make the hijacking stick. Well, instead, they lost the first key vote on maintenance budgets, but that's not all they lost. On Thursday, the House voted unanimously to retain Speaker Moyle and subsequently went to caucus, where they ousted House Majority Leader Representative Megan Blanksma by secret ballot. Blanksma was supportive and helped to pull off the hijack plan. So the fellow majority House members voted her out, and the MSC, or Main Street Caucus, was left licking its wounds. So who wins in the end? Well, fiscal responsibility wins. Ron Nate says the Idaho Freedom Foundation's mission is to protect and restore freedom, limit government, and reduce government spending. IFF's efforts this week to expose the collusion of some Republicans, Democrats, and Senate leaders were key in preserving the budget reform procedure. We reported on what was happening. We worked with legislators to help them see the problems, strategize for solutions, and beat back the attempts to spend your money. Budget reform will go far in stopping the waste of Idaho resources, as well as the rewards to special interests and abuses of the legislative process. So the bottom line is, this week, freedom won, fiscal responsibility won, and hardworking Idaho families won. The Idaho Freedom Foundation applauds those legislators who maintained their principles and who did the right thing despite many pressures to the contrary. Now, this may seem like, oh, well, this is so far removed from us. Why should we even care about this budget battle? Because this is one of many battles which is it's there to show you, if you're paying attention, who is on the side of your freedom and who isn't. And isn't it interesting? You know, all the negative press, the rumors, oh, well, the Idaho Freedom Foundation is about to fold. Why, they've had so much bad press and they've done so many horrible things. Really, what have they done? No, there's been a lot of angry people who see that, their game is up. Their grift is being exposed, and they're not able to get away with it, especially when those representatives or senators actually have to account for, I did vote for supporting this, or I did not vote for supporting this, cost increase. Believe it or not, smaller government is actually a good thing. Less taxes are actually a good thing. So, try not to be too easily swayed into thinking that anybody who would try to push for smaller government, lower taxes, more transparency, more accountability is somehow not on your side. They are. All right, let's move on here. This was funny in reference to the earlier tweet that I was talking about from the Idaho Freedom Caucus, about the Democrats and members of the Main Street Caucus just being upset and having to vote against public school appropriations. Maria Olson Nate says, this is hilarious. They're big mad because conservatives are implementing budget reform. And she says, yes, transparency and accountability for the win. And this was the tweet I was looking for earlier. Democrats and a few members of the Main Street Caucus voting against H460. Oh, I'm sure they don't like that. Well, just let us do our job, where we can do it out of view of the public. By the way, this was an interesting treatment on a bill that was just recently passed. I don't know if this one is as important to everybody because this doesn't hit your pocketbook, but there's a contingent that is trying to pretend there's nothing going on with indoctrinating your kids into LGBTQ plus ideology. But look at the pushback that happens here. Ruth Brown was a little less than circumspect in her headline here. The Idaho House of Representatives voted 54-14 on Wednesday to pass a bill that declares that there are only two sexes and genders. Like, they came up with the idea. They declare that there are only two sexes and genders, when everybody obviously knows, there's unlimited sexes and genders. No. So maybe a better choice of word would be what Idaho Press used in their article, which is the state approves a gender definitions bill that states there are only two sexes, or that codifies, or that otherwise acknowledges. But as far as they just declared, yeah, they made it up. Not quite. I want you to look at the reporting here, though. This is a good example of a very, very touchy subject for media because this involves kids and sexual considerations. For some reason, that's very, very important. It's being forced on us more all the time. So when someone pushes back and says, no, leave the kids alone, it's funny how it's portrayed as, well, this is a very hateful and scary thing. So in the Idaho Press report, the Idaho House voted Wednesday to pass legislation defining male and female and stating that there are only two sexes. Members voted 54-14 with one marked absent to send HB 421 to the Senate. Bill sponsor Representative Julianne Young of Blackfoot says the legislation seeks to answer a question of, are sex-based distinctions in the law appropriate and beneficial, or are they harmful instruments of oppression which should be undefined and erased? Well, she's kind of calling out the elephant in the room there, isn't she? That's really the question. Now, House Assistant Minority Leader Lauren Nicosia questioned the sources from which the definitions for sex or male or female came from. I think the definitions were along the lines of, look, if the reproductive anatomy you were born with produces sperm, you are a male. If it produces eggs, you are a female. That seems, pretty basic biology. No, there's not a lot of sophistry and nuance in there, but Nicosia was questioning the sources. She said that Young said she worked with the Heritage Foundation and the Alliance for Defending Freedom. Now, I want you to pay close attention here. She is very upset about those sources. Why, pray tell? Well, Nicosia says the the Alliance Defending Freedom. I'm getting ADF mixed up with the ADL. The ADF has said that the homosexual agenda will destroy Christianity and society. And the ADF, she points out, is on the Southern Poverty Law Center's webpage that designates ADF as an LGBT hate group. So the Southern Poverty Law Center has a webpage that delegates the Alliance Defending Freedom as an LGBTQ hate group. And this, they defended people like Baker, Jack Phillips in Colorado and so forth. But Nicosia says, these are not neutral sources that ought to be consulted for definitions that we want to put in our statute. Gee, I wonder who she would choose. And the fact is, this legislation attempts to write a segment of our population out of existence. Okay, well, she's wrong on a couple of points here. Anybody who would regard the Southern Poverty Law Center as a neutral source, we're just trying to help people understand, who's who out there. You've never looked into the SPLC. If you would consider them legitimate or a neutral source, no. In the same sense that the John Birch Society seems to have a bit of an aversion to commies. Have you noticed that? Yeah, they don't hide it very well. No, the Southern Poverty Law Center basically has they have a thing for anybody who is to the left of, or to the right rather, of Chairman Mao. It's a little bit scary, but they do have some clout. And this was interesting too. I thought this bore a little bit of mentioning. All Democrats voted against the bill. Okay, not surprising. They voted down a party line, as well as Republican Representatives Dan Garner of Clifton, Jack Nelson of Jerome, and Mark Souter of Sandpoint. Now look, I can't get into these guys' heads and tell you this is why they voted the way that they did, but I will tell you that on issues like this, it's a lot easier to try to virtue signal. Well, we don't want to send a message that's divisive, by acknowledging basic reality, that there are boys and there are girls and there's really nothing in between. But no, kind of a good test, if you will, for who is a politician versus who is a statesman. A statesman will state the truth even if it's unpopular, even if it may lead to people saying, well, then we can't support you politically. Statesman is about doing the right thing for the right reasons. Politician, I'll say whatever I think is advantageous to keep me in power. That's after saying anything I need to say to get in power in the first place. I wanted to share this with you just because those who, in fact, let me pull this down for just 1 second. Those who try to tell you that, these ideas that the LGBTQ crowd is trying to somehow indoctrinate your children or influence your children, why it's just a made up story and there's nothing to it, there's nothing going on. Okay, I've heard a lot of people deny it, or they offer the corollary, but if it is going on, it's a good thing because kids need to know that these people exist. All right, fair enough. Let's talk about why this is a very bad idea, though, to allow certain types of books, and I'm thinking about library bill type stuff, or even just, being taught in the classroom. Certain books really don't need to be taken to kids, and here's why. Writer AJK says, contrary to popular opinion, reading children's books about being trans in school is absolutely indoctrination. Why? Well, she says kids have feelings. They have feelings about what they like and what they don't like. They have feelings about their bodies and growing up. Now, she says when they read books that claim kids with the same feelings or who feel awkward and uncomfortable or prefer a certain kind of clothes or toys do so because they were born in the wrong body, well, they start to wonder if they too were born in the wrong body. And on top of the wrong body message, kids are also taught that trans kids are inherently brave and special, things kids really, really want to be perceived as. So the math is very simple. When you tell kids their feelings mean X and then you incentivize X, many will choose to adopt X. And she says the point being that without those explicit messages assigning meaning to and incentivizing their very normal feelings, kids would not arrive at the trans conclusion. It's imposed on them. And that's called indoctrination. And AJ says claiming otherwise is disingenuous. Now, I share that with you, not, so you can go out there and, beat everybody into submission with it. But just understand when people try to pretend that it's not really happening, no, it is. And it needs to be called what it is, which is indoctrination. Okay, couple quick thoughts as we bow out here today. Again, it's just funny to see sometimes the shoe on the other foot. Scott Herndon, Senator Herndon, says, it's amazing to me that Democrats voted for a private religious school voucher program last year when they voted for the Idaho Launch Program, which includes $8,000 vouchers to Northwest Nazarene University and BYU Idaho. My gosh, those are religious schools. You say taxpayer dollars going there? And of course, this is for the benefit of everybody who is in a bit of a dither over Tucker Carlson interviewing Vladimir Putin. Journalists confused by journalists doing journalism stuff. It's only funny because it's true. And all I can say is, look, anybody who would tell you you are not even allowed to consider what this person has to say, or you're not even allowed to hear their words or read their words, they're not doing that to protect you. That's not a matter of we're just trying to protect you from bad information. That's a matter of I have a narrative that I need you to believe, and I don't want you to encounter anything that would cause you to doubt it. So you don't have to be a Putin supporter. You don't have to be a Putin puppet or whatever kind of name people want to call you to say, isn't it interesting that there are people who are very determined that they think Tucker should never have interviewed him and that nobody should watch that interview because it's just so dangerous? What is it that makes it so dangerous? I wonder what their answer would be. This kind of underlines the importance of think for yourself and be grateful that there are alternatives out there. The mainstream media right now is not having a very good time, and I don't mean to rub salt in their wounds. I'm just telling you, it's a good time for other alternative sources to come together, and I trust that if you're willing to do your homework, you're the kind of person who is serious enough about the truth that you're willing to put in the work to find it, yeah, you're going to find it. Thanks again for joining me. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
that